Hello everybody, welcome to a deck profile for Toko Center Sanbaka. Just to give some context, this is currently, we're approaching the end of P01 format, Glowing Diva. In a couple weeks we will have Changing Diva come out, which will of course shake things up quite a bit. But in the meantime, I figured I'd give a quick profile to this deck, which has been a pretty strong deck in this meta and will continue to be at least somewhat reasonably strong into the future, but we'll get into that. Before we get into the deck, some general questions about why would you want to play this deck. So obviously the first one that I think some people will be attracted to is the fact that all of these characters, both the Elrigs and the Signy, are actual VTubers. They have channels, you can subscribe to them, you can follow them, watch their stuff. I'm not big into the VTuber scene, so I can't say from personal experience who's the best, who's the most popular, that kind of thing. But if you do follow those kind of things and you want to play with them, you actually have that option, which I think is pretty neat. Another reason to play this deck in this specific format is because it actually has a pretty good matchup against No Limit, which right now is the so-called boogeyman of the format. I think, in my opinion, No Limit is the strongest deck in P01 by a pretty substantial margin. And this particular build of Sanbaka actually matches up pretty well against No Limit. So if you are a competitive type person and you want to do well in tournaments and that kind of thing, this is a pretty good deck to do. It does have some blind spots and weaknesses. It has a tough matchup against Diagram for sure. It has a pretty tough matchup against Ancient Surprise, although not as tough as Diagram. But those two teams in particular are more on the bottom side of popularity right now. So it's the kind of deck where the deck that is the most popular has a tough matchup against Sanbaka, and two of the least popular decks are sort of the counter to it, so it's in a good meta spot right now, so to speak. The deck also has some very clear play lines in terms of what you should be doing on any given turn, and we'll go over that once we get into the Signy and some of the Elrigs. So it's not a terribly complicated deck. It's pretty easy to do reasonably well with this deck as long as the deck is constructed and you understand what it's supposed to do. Another reason why this deck may be appealing to you is because the deck is, for the most part, finished. Sanbaka, in particular, wants Virtual Signy, and as far as we know in the Japanese meta, which is several sets ahead, I think they're at P08, so they're about 7 sets ahead of us, there are no Virtual Signy. So if you want to build a deck with Virtual Signy, this is basically what you got, and there's some other options as well. But it's not the kind of deck you will need to be tweaking and changing constantly. There may be some Signy in the future, or potentially spells would be the one thing you may want to change as new ones come out. But for the most part, at least the bulk of the deck will stay intact moving forward, which is kind of a nice thing that you can just build the deck once. You don't really have to think about changing it. You kind of know what you're getting, and you know what the power level of that deck is. And the final reason why someone might want to play this deck is because it is surprisingly cheap. Sanbaka overall, again, it also suffers from having somewhat low popularity, so the pieces aren't terribly expensive. The single most important cards in the deck are a rare level 3 and a common level 1. So even though this deck does have some SRs and some cash cards in it, these are mostly optional. You can play with budget versions. I played in a pretty big tournament from WIXOSS Store. The first WIXOSS Store monthly tournament had 20 people in it. I placed second with this deck using basically no SRs at all. It was pretty much all Rina and Fuyuki, which we'll get into. But it's easy to play this deck at a high level without breaking the bank. So that's another reason why this deck may appeal to you, because some of the other decks that really require those SR cards or maybe the expensive pieces or that kind of thing, this deck is not one of them. So now let's get into the cards in the deck. So let's start with the Center Toko, level 3. She has an enter effect to add up to 2 target Virtual Signy from your trash to your hand. That is extremely good in this particular deck, and we will get into why when we get into the Signy with that. She also has a once per turn action to trash a Virtual Signy on your field to give target Signy on your opponent's field -3k until end of turn. Another good removal option. It also gives Toko some flexibility in terms of clearing out lanes. Usually you only have one option to clear out of lanes if your opponents are freezing. It's not really a big thing in this current meta, but basically she can turn any virtual Signy card in her hand into a removal spell. If you think of it that way, you basically play a Signy, trash it, minus 3k, you know, bing bang boom, you're done. For the assists, I use the standard Lies level 1, look at top 7, you reveal up to 2 black virtuals and add them to your hand. All the virtual Signy in this deck are black, so there's no mathematical way really to whiff on this, unless you pull 4 servants and like 3 spells is the only possible way you're not getting 2 cards. All of the black virtual Signy tend to be really good anyway. They're, even if this particular build skews very heavily black, but most of the really good Signy in Sanbaka are black anyway, so that one tends to be better. The Lies level 2 is 2 to grow. Return target Signy in your opponent's field to its owner's hand, so some lane clearing. It's both offensive and defensive because it has attack phase timing. You can use it on your opponent's attack phase to save one of your life cloth and also open a lane. And then a white and 1 to add a target guard Signy from your trash. If you need the extra defensive options, you can pull a servant back, which is also really good. In my playing this deck, because it mills so heavily and fills up the graveyard, it does tend to have a problem pulling those guards like naturally through draw effects, so the ability to get one back with Lies is really helpful. For Angie, I use the 1 to enter, pay 1 to trash a target Signy with 10k or less. The other one, where she basically does the same thing as Lies, you return a Signy. They're both fine. I prefer this one just because it has more resource denial options. Trashing a card is better as far as resource management is concerned, as getting him back to your hand for your opponent to potentially play again. This deck tends to be very fast, so in those faster situations you really want to deny your opponent as many resources as possible to basically race to the finish line. So it is not uncommon for this deck to win on turn 4, so as many resources as you can deny as possible is good. For the level 2, I use a different one than most people use. This one is free to grow, attack phase timing, so both of those things are extremely good. Enter effect, you can put a virtual Signy from your hand onto your field. The enter abilities do not activate, and then you can pay 2 colorless to do it again. So if your opponent is clearing out your lanes, you can activate this. You can drop 2 Signy on the board, block 2 of their attacks. If they do still decide to attack into those Signy, which is possible, you also end up potentially being enter neutral on this, which is extremely good because this deck has problems with enter gain in general. So basically imagine, a situation where your lanes are open, you play 2 Signy down with this card, so it costs you 2 enter total. If they attack into those, you've now just made 2 enter. And this deck, outside of battling Uchu, it never has problems getting cards in hand. So having those extra cards as potential enter resources, or even just as blockers that you can then trash, you can, enter charge 1 of those 2 on your next turn. You can trash one of them to Toko. So there's really very little risk in playing this card. And it's also extremely good against some of the no-limit double crush options. This level 2 in particular is why the matchup against no limit is so good, in my opinion, because that deck is really fast and it has very kind of specific mathematical timings in terms of what you should attack and when, and this really changes the math a lot. And it basically means that you kind of gain the upper hand using it. So for the pieces, Samba Carnival, in my opinion, is a no-brainer. It's 5 cost. You get to trash an opponent's Signy, you get to bounce an opponent's Signy, and then you get to add a virtual Signy from your trash to your hand, which is basically the 3 things that this deck wants to do the most. It's a little expensive at 5, but there's not a whole lot else that this deck really uses enter for, frankly. So the ability to save up and then basically have a blowout turn where now you're opening up 2 lanes, you're denying resources, both of these Signy that get removed do not generate enter, which is helpful, and then you can return a virtual Signy back, which again is kind of the theme of the deck. It's extremely good to basically act as a finishing move. I also run Super Helestus Saber as a support piece. So it's 2 to play. You can add up to 1 target white Signy and 1 target black Signy and 1 target colorless Signy from your trash to your hand. The only white Signy in the deck are the 2 dual colors, so that's less exciting. But the fact that it can get your other black Signy combo pieces is extremely helpful, and it also gets you a guard back, which is very good for a piece card. So again, like I was saying before, the deck struggles generating guards naturally just because it trashes so much. So having the ability to get those back after they get milled is extremely helpful. All right, for the main deck, we'll start with the level 1s and just work our way up. 4 servants, because 4 servants, there's just no reason not to run 4. The main and most important level 1 that we have is Fuyuki Hakase, who is ironically, the card itself is not very good. It has an enter ability to target Signy opponent's field at -1k, which really is mostly irrelevant. There's been like one situation where it has mattered, but for the most part, this is an ability that's not very good. But the reason you run her is because she specifically combos with Rina Yurumi, who's looking for Fuyuki. We'll get to her in a minute, but Fuyuki is probably the most important level 1. Which is ironic because I think the strongest level 1 in the deck is Melissa, who is a enter ability to trash the top 3 cards of your deck, and then has a constant, as long as there are 5 or more virtual Signy in your trash, she gets plus 5k. So in a perfect turn 1 opener, you can basically play 2 Melissa, trash a bunch of Signy. If you hit 5 out of 6 of those as virtuals, which, judging by the ratio of the deck, it's not undoable. I mean, there's only 8 cards that are not virtual Signy in the deck. Now all of a sudden you have 2 7Ks on turn 1, which are extremely sticky and hard to deal with, especially for No Limit, because if you played No Limit, you know they run Romale, they run Lancelot, and having Melissa at 7k, level 1, she dodges both of those, which is extremely good. It means that you'll have a lot of defensive staying power early on in the game, which will get you in a better position in the late game. I also run for Sarah, who is the dual cost level 1. There is some white that's necessary with Liza's Grow, her optional ability to pull a guard back, and the dual colors are just generally good cards, so you don't feel bad running them, so I run 4 of those as well. For level 2s, since we already talked about it, I run 4 Maos, again for the same reason, just generic vanilla level 2, 2 colors, 10k, so reasonably sticky for a level 2. I also run 4 copies of, where is she, Mirigundo, who has an enter ability to pay a black to trash the top 3, then put a virtual Signy from your trash, a level 1 virtual Signy from your trash to your field. So she basically does what Melissa does, except you have to pay for it. The exception here is that Miri trades enter for card advantage. So if you're in a situation where you have had a lot of cards removed, maybe you're against Uchu and you've had a lot of discarding or whatever, your hand is low, you have the option to pay an enter to basically get a card back. This is also extremely good in the late game, because if there's a situation where maybe all your Fuyukis you've had to use either as blockers or attackers early on, you're out of Fuyukis, you can potentially play a Mirigundo, activate her to bring a Fuyuki back onto the field from your trash, which will then in turn activate Rina Yurumi. So, speaking of Rina Yurumi, the single most important card in the deck, Rina Yurumi, who has an enter ability. If Fuyuki is on the field, target Signy gets -4k until end of turn, so she's basically a free removal spell, kind of similar to how Toko acts as it turns any card into that. Rina basically has that ability on her own. As if that were not enough, she has an auto ability that whenever she attacks until end of turn, all Signy on your opponent's field get -1k for each virtual Signy, which is always going to be 3. So basically, the ideal game plan is grow to 3, play a Fuyuki, give something, an incidental -1k. You can play 2 Rina Yurumis to give them, basically spread 2 -4ks however you need, and then when you start attacking with them, basically you can give your opponent's field a -6k, which is, 3k between the 2 of them. So basically between all of those effects, there is virtually nothing that can stand in the way of this deck. There's a couple of Signy that have Shadow, most notably Arc Gwyn, but there is also a virtual one that does it. Those are harder to remove. There's a green Signy called Amino Acid, which is completely immune to all of these effects, and in fact the negative powers actually make it grow, so that's also very difficult to deal with, but nobody's really playing Amino Acid right now, so that's less important. But other than that, you're basically always going to be swinging in at 3 open lanes, and you're doing that without using Enter and just using the Signy that you play on the field, and that in itself is why this deck is so strong, because it's so efficient at removing cards, it's so efficient at dealing damage and getting in. It forces your opponents to use their defensive options potentially earlier than they would like. You know, if they haven't generated enough Enter to maximize their effects potentially, or cards depending on what they're using. So it puts a lot of pressure on, and because Rina is so strong, again, this deck really is consistently winning on turn 4, even if you don't crush a whole lot of life cloth early on, just based on the fact that turn 3 you're swinging in 3 Signy for 3 and you're Elrig for 4, and then you just do it again, so 8 damage over turns 3 and 4. You know, outside of defensive options and that sort of thing, but that's just going to be something you have to deal with. But Rina is so strong at opening lanes and just causing a ruckus, and she's the reason why this deck is competitive. There are decks in the future that actually run virtual packages featuring Rina Yurumi, just because she is and still remains so strong. So for other level 3s, less exciting but still good, I like to run 4 Lulus. She has a once per turn ability to pay a black and 1 to give a target Signy minus 10k and then trash the top 10 cards of your deck. That's helpful. There are some big Signy potentially that you may use this on. Really the reason to use Lulu is because of her constant, which is you don't trash your life cloth if you need to refresh. So if the game does somehow go longer than you expect it to, you do have a reset button that with all the milling, the self-milling and trashing you're doing, you have an option to refresh your deck without taking damage, which is extremely important. Her once per turn kind of feeds into this, where if it's a situation where you really need a refresh on this turn before your opponent can remove the Lulu, you basically have the option to do this to refresh your own deck, and do it that way. So the other level 3 I run is 4 Nuis. She has an auto. Whenever a virtual Signy enters your field, you can look at the top card and trash it. That's basically useless. I mean, there are a couple of effects where, again, if you need an emergency refresh, that kind of thing, but for the most part, I don't think I've ever used this in a meaningful way. But she does have an auto at the beginning of your attack phase. If there are 20 or more virtual Signy in the trash, you can pay black and 1 to vanish target Signy. The reason I run this card is specifically for this effect, to outright vanish something, because every other card in the deck vanishes by means of reducing power. So just having the option to do so outright without needing to worry about subtracting power, like maybe they're immune with amino acid, maybe they've been boosted some other way, whatever, its effect probably doesn't come in to play in most games, in most matchups, but just having this as an option if those things start to creep up, it's just nice to have. So the last thing is we have 4 copies of Under Attractive as a spell, which is if an effect of your Signy would subtract power, the amount that would be subtracted is doubled. So, I mean, we've gone through all of the options, so basically now your Rinas are minus 8k on enter, and, you know, a total of minus 12k when they attack, which is just ludicrous. Costs 2 enter, so really not terribly expensive for a removal spell. There's also a clause that if you have 25 or more cards in your trash, you get a target Signy without a guard from your trash to your hand. So this can also act as recursion, which is really important for the deck. It kind of fits the theme as well. Having 25 or more cards in the trash is not a huge ask, surprisingly, for this deck. So you can get there pretty easily. And again, it's just really, you run it for the top effect, and this is just kind of a nice to have, so it's really not the end of the world if it gets there. So as far as basic gameplay strategy, your early game, the goal, especially in the mulligan stage, is basically get and play as many Melissas as you can to just fill the trash. Melissa is a really strong card, and she will kind of catapult you into late game if you can get her early. And then even on, you know, turn 2, playing. It's never a wrong move to play a Melissa unless you were about to refresh your deck, which doesn't really happen very often. So play as many Melissas as you can, grow to 3. As soon as you get to 3, do the Fuyuki and Rina Yurumi combo, and just kind of go from there. So that is also another reason why I didn't mention this when I talked about Ange level 2. I mentioned the fact that she's 0 to grow. This is also extremely important just because of the fact that you really need the +1 limit. Not all the time, but there are scenarios where you know you'll need to basically grow into level 3, play a Fuyuki and 2 Rinas, and kind of have them stick just to force that pressure. So having the ability to have a free to grow level 2, not this one, that will give you that +1 limit, and still, you know, kind of act as a nice defensive option as well. It's relevant. I mean, because of how much this deck does struggle with Enter on its own, sometimes you're forced into those positions. So that's one of the reasons why I like that card, and I feel like it works well with what this particular deck is trying to do. So for future of the deck, there really isn't one, as I mentioned before, just because of the lack of virtual Signy that are coming out. There may be some options for replacing some of these for other things. I don't know in terms of numerical values what the right number of virtual Signy is to be able to consistently hit Rina to get that -3k when attacking. The biggest draw of Rina is actually the enter of the -4k, so having the Rina and Fuyuki is extremely important. So, I mean, the goal is kind of to get those anyway. The rest of the virtual Signy just kind of add to the consistency, but I can definitely see scenarios where you're replacing the vanillas for something else. Ideally something that's at white to, again, power the lies level 2. But changing the spells out, I think, is fine as well. I really like Underattractive. It does everything that this deck wants to do, so it's going to be hard to replace that one, in my opinion, but I can see it. Again, the Lulus and the Nuis you could replace for something else. Really, the crux of the deck is Rina and Fuyuki, and you can kind of build around it with whatever virtual Signy you want or need, or if there are other Signy you want to replace with these in the future, that's definitely a possibility. But unfortunately, just because of the lack of virtual Signy, this deck is at its strongest right now. So the right time to start playing Sanbaka is yesterday, but if you obviously are too late for that, you can play it now, and it's still a strong deck. Like I said, it's strong against No Limit, which is extremely relevant right now. It will stay reasonably strong, just because of, on the back of Rina Yurumi, how strong she is as a Signy. So it will still continue to perform. It will just have a hard time. It doesn't really keep up with the other decks. So it's at its strongest right now, and it will continue to be as strong as it is. The problem is that the other decks will just continue to catch up and eventually pass it. So if you want to start playing Sanbaka, now is the time to do it. I highly recommend it. It's a very strong deck. It's surprisingly fun. I built it just because when Interlude Diva came out, that was just the options. You had a Sanbaka deck and you had an Ancient Surprise deck, and that was basically it. And then I played with it, and I was surprised at how strong and consistent it was. I personally thought that this conditional looking for Fuyuki was just not going to happen. So even though I recognized that this card was strong, I didn't think it would consistently be able to pull it off, but it is. I mean, in every game that I've played, I've had the combo when I needed it. So it's a strong deck, it's good, pretty easy to pilot. So hopefully you enjoy that. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, etc., feel free to let me know. But otherwise, take care.